This reading and this conversation is about Howard Thurman, who was a theologian and a mystic and really the pastor to the prophet of the civil rights movement. I encountered, I had known of Howard Thurman for some number of years, but really in this last fall when I was doing the leadership class that I talked to you about last month, this quote came across my reading, and it will not let me go. This quote will not let me go. And so I'm bringing it to you and want to see what we can make of it together. And I am going to share this quote in the next newsletter, so you'll have it. So you'll have this with you. But here we go. This is Howard Thurman. There is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there is an island, and on that island there is an altar, and standing guard before that altar there is an angel with a flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon your altar unless it be a part of the area of fluid consent. The fluid area of your consent. The fluid area of your consent. This is your crucial link with the eternal. I'm going to read it again. The inward sea. There is in every person an inward sea, and in that sea there is an island, and on that island there is an altar, and standing guard before that altar is the angel with the flaming sword. Nothing can get by that angel to be placed upon that altar unless it has the mark of your inner authority. Nothing passes the angel with the flaming sword to be placed upon your altar unless it be part of the fluid area of your consent. This is your crucial link with the eternal. There's so much richness in that imagery, place and geography, and hearkening back to an old theology, an angel with a flaming sword. I hadn't thought about an image like that in a really long time. But he doesn't ask me to believe in a theology that I can't grab a hold of. He uses it as a metaphor of something that holds my integrity. So I want to unpack that a little bit. I want to give a little biographical information about Howard Thurman in case you're not familiar with him. As we move into Black History Month, and see what meaning this may have for us as this congregation moves into its social justice work, its social action work. And what does it mean for us as activists to have clarity and authority and integrity in our own work? I am sometimes asked, should we focus more on spirituality or social justice and action? And I think that is a false dichotomy. I think the way Thurman was writing this and what it says to me is that they are together. And so I want to, that's where I'm trying to go a little bit this morning. Howard Thurman was born just 44 days before the turn of the 20th century, November 18th, 1899. His grandmother was born enslaved. He grew up in segregated Daytona Beach, Florida, and there were few educational opportunities for this boy who evidenced a kind of intellect, both emotional and mental intellect. But his family knew, his mother and his grandmother knew that education was the way out. And so he worked and worked and was the first African American to receive a diploma from the 8th grade and then from high school in Daytona Beach, Florida. He went on to Morehouse College in Atlanta. He went on to Rochester Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, and where he delivered lectures to audiences that were populated with members of the KKK. You might have expected that more in Atlanta and not in Rochester, New York, but racism is everywhere, even in the North, right? We know this. This is not a surprise. I'm remembering a history from what I wrote, and let's see how much I remember. He studied with a mystic and a Quaker, Rufus Jones, and so he was known throughout his life, didn't want to really be known as a theologian, but understood himself as a mystic. And so some of this language we hear in here has a kind of a mystic quality, and that came from his early seminary training. In 1944, he went to California to co-found and be the pastor of the first intentionally multiracial congregation in the United States, the Church of the Fellowship of All People. And it eventually, in San Francisco, and it eventually grew to about 250 people. About half of the congregation was white, and about half of the congregation was black and Chinese and Japanese and Filipino. And they had the support from congregations, other congregations all over the world, Great Britain and Spain and Thailand and South Africa. There was support for this congregation, this experiment from all over the world. In the 1950s, he left San Francisco and went to Boston to become the dean of Marsh Chapel at Boston College, the first African American to hold that position, and he held that position until he died. Until he retired in the mid-60s. Howard Thurman was known as Martin Luther King's soft place to land. He was the pastor to the prophet. There was a story about Dr. King having written a book, and he was in Harlem in the early 60s at a department store doing a book signing. And a woman who was suffering from schizophrenia came to this book signing, and she stabbed Dr. King with a letter opener. And in the last speech of his life, Dr. King referred back to that moment. The doctors told him that if he had sneezed, the blade would have cut his aorta. And in his last speech of his life in April of 1968, he said, "I'm glad I didn't sneeze." And you may have heard that echo. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have seen this happen. If I had sneezed, we wouldn't have seen this happen, and so on. So at that moment, when King was recuperating in the hospital, I think this was 1963, King is recuperating in the hospital in New York, and Thurman comes from Boston to New York to see Dr. King. And King is recuperating well. It was a very serious injury, but they were able to take care of it. Fortunately, nobody moved the blade, and they got him the help he needed, and he was recuperating, and he was about to go back to work. And Thurman was the one who said to him, "Don't go back to work yet. Take some time. Take some time off. Take the time for yourself. Go inward. Find out what you are supposed to do next." He was actually calling him to take a sabbatical. King had been working and working and working, and this was the only time that we know of in his civil rights work that he did not preach, he did not take speaking engagements, and he didn't publish anything for writing. He took some extra time that he wasn't planning to. And Thurman's three questions for King and for students throughout his life, and the people who came to study with him, was, who am I? What do I want? And how do I plan to get it? Who am I? What do I want? And how do I plan to get it? Identity, purpose, and method. Who am I? Identity. What do I want? What's my purpose? And method. How do I plan to get it? And man, I think that is important for every one of us individually and as a congregation, as a community. Who are we? What do we want? And how do we plan to get it? The more I read this work, I think it is interior work and it is communal work. There are stories about him that he had this great booming laugh and also could hold profound moments of silence. In an interview with Krista Tippett in her program now, podcast on being, she was interviewing Otis Moss III. And Otis Moss, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, is now the pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. That's the congregation where Jeremiah Wright was the pastor and where the Obamas were members, may still be, I don't know. Here's a little bit of the conversation between Krista Tippett and Otis Moss. Tippett says, "You called Thurman a mystic. And it feels to me in some ways that he was so much ahead of his time. It's interesting to me, you were a part of this documentary about Howard Thurman. There's a wonderful documentary on YouTube. I think it's called Backs Against the Wall. I think that's right. Krista Tippett said, I noted down all the different ways people described what he was like, what was his role. Pastor to the leaders, moral anchor for the movement, had an established philosophical framework, teacher, spiritual activist, mystic, contemplative spirituality, nature mystic, talking to trees. This is where he was very much ahead of his time. He was a saint for the movement. And I think, to me, what Moss had just said, it would be surprising to people who have a basic sort of what we learned in history about the civil rights movement, to know that it had a mystic at the center who was a pastor to the leaders and the teachers and the activists. I think many of us in here are come outers of other faith traditions, and we might, if pressed, describe ourselves as maybe kindly as post-Christian, maybe unkindly as anti-Christian. And yet we still have a lot of regard for the work of the civil rights movement. I think we ignore the basic fundamental spirituality and Christianity of the civil rights movement. When we do that, we ignore something that is foundational to it. That also is Christianity. And let us not conflate the two Christianities that we might, sort of white Christian nationalism with this kind of Thurman's great book was Jesus and the Disinherited. And it is said that Dr. King carried 3 books with him at all times: the Bible, the U.S. Constitution, and Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. So this was the moral underpinning of the civil rights movement. Replied to Krista Tippett, it's fascinating that so many people who were part of the movement have these unique Howard Thurman stories. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had this connection, King had the connection, and Thurman was always pushing them on this inward journey on who they are and their encounter to find, in his words, the sound of the genuine. What's the sound of the genuine in us? Discover that. Discover what makes you come alive. And the encounter with the Spirit, the encounter with silence, the encounter with, as he said it, with God, with the God of justice. Maybe that's with nature. Maybe that is with good, orderly direction. Get the acronym. Good, orderly direction. Great outdoors. What is it that has the mark of our inner authority? What is most genuine in us? Thurman, I believe in this work of the inner sea and this angel with the flaming sword. I think each of us can grab a hold of that in some way. And he had 6 markers that we might use as something of a rubric about it. That these landmarks invite us to, how are we navigating around? How are we in relationship with these landmarks? One was a knowledge of presence. For him, that was a presence of an inner light that he understood from the Quaker upbringing or training that he had. I think for us as Unitarian Universalists, we talk about the worth and dignity of every person. That also includes us. That we have inner light as well. What's our relationship to that? Are we carrying shame? And what do we need to do with that shame so that we can be in right relationship with the angel with the flaming sword, right? One is integrity. Not only integrity in my relationship with you, but with all of the planet. If I am, as you've heard me say many times, in relationship from the tiniest quark to the outer reaches of the universe, in a chain of being, how do I have integrity in that relationship? And how can I measure that? One is love. Not a wimpy, mamby-pamby love. If I believe, and I do, that love is the strongest force on the planet, how do we organize love to really make a difference? And if I am operating out of love, then I'm sustainable. If I'm operating out of hatred and fear and anger, I'm not sustainable. And boy, I say it all the time, it's easy to work up that head of steam and operate out of that fear and anger. I'm much more sustainable when I operate out of love. Freedom, a sense of freedom, to be free in who I am. Thurman was operating before gender equality was much of a thing, though he did believe in women leaders in the church that he founded and had many women colleagues, when many male pastors, especially many black male pastors, did not do so. And so he was on the vanguard of that. But I'm thinking of freedom now. How do we create freedom for ourselves to move in our bodies and for other people to move in their bodies? Of course, he was calling for freedom in a civil rights way, in a racial way, and of course that is still very much responsible. And lastly, that freedom entails responsibility. That once we are in relationship with this angel with the flaming sword, we have responsibility not only to our own inner authority, but we have responsibility to the outer world. That's where I think our social justice and our spirituality come together. And imagination. How can I imagine you and I as not only equal but co-creative? I think Thurman was calling on a white audience to imagine people of different races as equal and co-creative. So there's a lot in here. We don't have to. I'm not going to give you the whole thing. But that idea of there's a sea and there is this place that's the center. What's my center? I'll close with just a story. Yesterday I met a friend for coffee. We've known each other for 30 years. We met each other in the theater, doing dinner theater back in the day. Oh gosh, we were young and we were pretty, and we were thin and we were stupid, and we just thought we were everything. We thought we were all that. And we did. That summer we were doing a dinner theater show in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. Yeah. The Fireside, right? You know the Fireside? Yeah. They're probably still serving that, a sweet potato bake. It was great. It was great fun. And I remember that summer as being very effervescent and I just felt so full of the world and full of myself and all of that. We talked for a while, and what I remembered is that also I was drinking heavily, and I was behaving in ways that had little to no integrity, and looking back on it, I don't really like that person all that much. And it felt very shiny. At the time, it felt very shiny and effervescent. And now when I look back on it, I actually don't have shame around it. But there was no inner authority. Everything got past. There's no angel with a flaming sword. Everything got past. The altar was littered. And I, through my life, through sobriety for me, but through Unitarian Universalism, through a spiritual life and a social justice life, and through being in relationship with you, I've been able to grow my integrity back and watch you operate in ways that have integrity. And find a spiritual maturity. So we start wherever we are. We've all got our stuff. And we can keep coming to that island on the inward sea. May it be so. And safe passage on the journey.